the second part of our economic and political overview. And of course, the two rogues that I have on the platform with me here really don't need a lot of introduction. John Brumby, of course, former Premier here in Victoria, former Treasurer here in Victoria, former federal member for Bendigo. On my right, and absolutely on my right, is Peter Reith. Peter, of course, had a long and distinguished career in the Federal Parliament. He was variously Minister for Small Business. I shadowed him. He was variously Minister for Defence. Sadly, I shadowed him again. And he, since retiring, has become a journalist, as they all do, I guess, and is involved in a number of different organisations. But look, the time now really is to have a bit of a chat up here. I've assumed the position of Mr. Speaker in the middle, and my two colleagues are going to give something of an overview very quickly of where they, through some questions that we put to them about where they think politics is heading. And then, of course, it is again for you, questions to you. There's no formal presentations from either of them. So, look, I guess, gentlemen, just a quick warm-up. Where are we heading in Australia in politics at the present moment, from your perspective? You've both been in government, you've both had significant positions. We've seen uncertainties, we've seen great white hopes emerge, we've seen all sorts of things, but where are we going, and how can we get the political class to support everything that we've heard is necessary to drive the economy of Australia? John, I might defer to you first.
Well, thank you, Stephen. So one of the things that I've not been in my post-political life is a political commentator, so I haven't been. But I think that, you know, to make an obvious point, the political system federally is quite volatile at the moment. What Australia really needs, I think, as we've heard from some of the speakers today, in the medium and longer term, is a serious reform agenda. I don't think we're seeing that presented, and I think it's probably unlikely to see that presented before a federal election. And if you listen to the commentators like Peter Reith and Graham Richardson, who were on earlier this morning, they'd say that it would appear with a high degree of certainty that Australia is on track for an early federal election. And so you're going to see the debate more and more about politics and less about policy and substance. So I've always been in the camp that I think we've got a lot of big issues facing Australia, to state the obvious. We've had a great track record for 25 years, but really the world has caught up to us. So I'm not a doom and gloom person, but the fact is we need a pretty ambitious reform agenda. We need it fiscally. We need it in terms of our federation. We need an economic reform agenda. I think it's terrific that Malcolm Turnbull and Bill Shorten, by the way, have put a focus on innovation. But the reality is, as you saw from Michael's slides before, we're not getting anywhere near enough government investment in infrastructure, which Australia is crying out for. There's a whole lot of reasons for that. So I think, you know, we do need to embrace a reform agenda, and I don't think we're really seeing much of that come out of Canberra.
Peter, an early election?
Well, 2nd of July. 2nd of July is what they're all saying.
Heard it here first, CEDA, once again.
There you go. Look, I'd have to say I basically agree with John. I think we're going to have a usual Australian election, so don't be surprised. It'll be pretty much the same. The issues are going to be the same. There's nothing new about it. And the demand that that really faces us of real reform, unfortunately, is not going to give the sort of attention which I think it should get. And this is the challenge that governments have and oppositions have. We had a good run under Bob Hawke, and we had a good run under John Howard, and it's been difficult to get real reform at any other period in my experience in Australian politics. I accept what Michael says about the sort of state of play, the expectations he's got. It's a sort of fairly pedestrian, shall we say, expectation of how things are going to go. What'd you say, 2.5%, I think you said, Michael? It's not a great number. The unemployment number picked up, the unemployment number moved up to 6%. I don't know where it's going to go in the future, but taking your numbers is going to be pretty flat wherever it is. And it's very easy to say, well, look, we're not doing worse than anybody else. But what we'd really prefer to have from our political masters is to have an attitude which says, let's see if we can do a hell of a lot better than where we are now. Don't benchmark ourselves against the average. Why don't we go for something really good? My worry is that we'll fall into a situation we've had in the past, which is we wait until things are really bad and only then will we really get some real reform. It's a bit disappointing. There are some good things going out there. There's some great people running good businesses and everything else, so there are a whole lot of positives, but we really should be doing more.
John's a bit sad if as Peter's suggesting, that it's going to be a same election campaign, same. Do you perceive that is likely to be the case based on your experience?
Well, I think it's good that on the Labor side of things, there's been some policy that's been put out earlier. So I think that's a good thing. I think if you're an opposition leader, to anyone who's ever been in that role, it's always very difficult. It's quite a risky thing to put policy out early. But I think on the Labor side, what Labor's done in terms of superannuation, fairly modest changes at the high end, but some policy reform there, and in terms of negative gearing, and there'll be a range of views about negative gearing, but I think it's the right thing to put those things out for debate. But really, I just come back to what I said before, on the really big issues, the budget deficit, and I don't pretend that's easy. I've been a treasurer, and I was a treasurer through most of the good years, when the economy was growing, so it was probably a little easier. But the reality is that, the deficit is horribly large. Like, you've got to call a spade, and you do have to drag a deficit back into surplus. It's interesting, by the way, as you'll recall, Stephen, when Bob Hawke went to the election in July '87 and won convincingly, it was after a budget in May that significantly cut expenditure and got the budget back into surplus. So you can make changes, but if you look at the federal deficit, 50 billion plus in reality, it requires effort on the revenue side and the expenditure side. It's not just on the revenue side and it's not just on the expenditure side. It requires a bit of each. It's one of the reasons why I've been out for the last 2 years. I'm a supporter of increasing the GST, because I think our tax system is hopelessly out of balance, and you could use some of that revenue to pay down some of that deficit. But I think we're not going to see a big debate, a proper debate about those things. But, our debt is still low by, American or Chinese standards, but the reality is it is ratcheting up very, very quickly indeed. And, I won't be paying for that, but my children will. And so I think this fiscal issue is real. And then, as I said, you've got to get onto the economic stuff. Infrastructure, Michael, I had a meeting with Hong Kong company the other week. This is MTR, they're building 50 kilometres of new underground in Hong Kong in the next few years. Shanghai in the last decade has built 100 kilometres of underground, more than London and New York combined have built in 100 years. And in Australia, we're still having this debate about the Metro Rail project, which the Andrews government wants to do, which is a great project, right? Great project, which Victoria urgently, desperately needs, and we're still having this squabble about whether it's going to get federal money. So we've got to strip away some of that. We've got to get on with the job, more projects, better funded, completed more rapidly. That's what needs to happen in Australia.
Peter, John's raised a number of different issues, of course, and when there was a change in Prime Ministership, Prime Minister Turnbull said everything's on the table. And as I remarked to you a little earlier, it's a bloody big table, but there's not much left on it. And if you're looking for a decent feed, you go hungry at the minute. What do we do to try and re-stimulate that appetite for bringing more back onto the table? Is it too late? Is it all gone?
Can I go back to 1987, just for starters? Because actually there is a story there, or a lesson, because I was in the Parliament when that Hawke government did some real cutting, and the truth is they had the opposition agreeing with them. And let's face it, the political system has become more toxic in recent times, whether it's just the pressures coming out of the GFC or whether we just haven't had the Prime Ministers that we really need to have, however you want to describe it. But I think that is a reality. And I'd have to say, I think the proposal, a bill that's about to go in to change the Senate situation, the reform proposed there, it won't fix all the problems. The Senate's not going to be all that much easier in the change, but I think it is a step in the right direction, I'd have to say. So that's the first thing. Look, it's fair enough for Labor to put up its proposals, and you know, you can debate the individual items, but I'd have to say, as a general proposition, what we're really looking for is a much broader approach. I think once you start tinkering, I mean, the accountants, look, they'll take an issue of negative gearing and, you know, whatever they pick up under the existing system, don't worry, they'll turn around tomorrow and have another scheme, you know, to fix their position. And we do need a broader approach. Now, it's the same with the capital gains tax. I'm personally totally opposed to more taxes, as I am in respect of negative gearing. But if somebody comes up with a really big package, well, that'd be a different cup of tea, wouldn't it? So I was in London for a few years, jobs for the boys situation for a while, thanks very much. But it was very interesting in Eastern Europe, you know, because when they came down, they brought the wall down, and they had to start again, basically, some of those places like Slovenia. You know, what did they do? Well, I think it was Slovenia. They ended up with a 19% GST, a 19% capital gains tax, a 19% income tax, etc., etc. I mean, basically, they had the thing, you know, sewn up right from the start. None of this business of, you know, millions of bloody accountants trying to beat the system. A broad base, low rates, that's where you should be aiming for across the board. And we're a long way from that. And it's that sort of broader thinking which is very hard to put up today because of the political situation. I think the Senate reform is going to help that a bit, but it also does require politicians on both sides to be far more ambitious than what they've been so far. Let's just hope we don't get into a situation which is worse than what Michael said, because then we'll just all pay a very high you know, penalty for it, and it'll be the people who are most vulnerable who will cop it, I can tell you now.
And so, I don't want to keep dwelling on tax because I know you want to get back to politics, but I can say this, you know, safely now because neither side of politics would appear to be supporting changes in the GST. But the fact is, if you look at our tax system today, we are more reliant on company tax and income tax than we were when the GST was introduced. And there's a range of reasons for that, and we forget that the wholesale sales tax got abolished and so on. So our system has become more unbalanced than it was in 2000 when John Howard and Peter Costello made that change. And what that means, if you think, you know, back to some of the comments Amanda made before, you know, if you're a company competing in Australia, two things, you know, capital is mobile around the world, so the higher your company tax rate, the less competitive Australia is in terms of attracting FDI. And secondly, just in terms of personal income tax, again, people are more mobile and industries are more mobile. And if we've got people moving into the 38 and 40% brackets, it costs more to employ them than it does in other parts of the world. So I think this debate about rebalancing the tax system, using some of that to help the states and pay down the deficit, but also levering down company tax and income tax, that's, you know, in the medium term, that's going to do more to stimulate economic growth and investment than I think any other single reform. But and it's interesting, if you go back to 2000, again, as we'll all recall, the drive for that change, while it was completed, consummated by government, it was actually the Business Council and ACOS that were the big drivers of getting a GST, because they came to an understanding about divvying up the money, abolishing state taxes, and nobody was worse off as a result of that. In fact, people were probably a little bit overcompensated. Yeah,
but I mean, you know, I hear what you say, but basically, if you want big reform, the people who are going to make it happen are the pollies. It's got nothing to do with the BCA or anybody else, no disrespect, but it ends up as a political issue. Listen, mate, I spent 3 years flogging the GST at 15%, paid a fair penalty for it. Okay, I get paid for it, I suppose, but understand that's where it starts and that's where it finishes.
Yeah, save that. I mean, again, the point I think that John's making is that, and this is where I think potentially at the moment it seems to have been lost. If you go back to the tax debate here, the business community, ACOS, the community more generally, thought that they were participating in a genuine debate in making submissions to government that were then going to produce a green paper, which would then become a green paper, a green paper then a white paper. The same thing happened with the Federation, where, as CEDA pointed out in one of its pieces of research, some of the issues of defining whose responsibility between the feds and the states meant that you had to look at the way in which revenue was raised and so on. And part of that, of course, was looking then at having the white paper on federation and the white paper on taxation dovetailed together. Now, of course, all that goodwill has disappeared because simply government has said, despite the expense that the business community, the community went to more generally about putting all that information through, trying to be a player in it, you're saying it's really the pollies that are going to drive it, and in this case it's not driving it, it's actually eliminating it.
Yeah, but look, I'm a bit disappointed we haven't got further, but I'd also have to say, having spent a year with John Hewson working on Fight Back, which is probably the most extensive mandate we've seen anybody put up to the Australian electorate, it took a hell of a lot of time and a hell of a lot of good brain work to put that together. The truth is, expectations have been very high on Malcolm Turnbull. I think unreasonably high, because it just barely had the time to get into it. I mean, crikey, it's only, what, 4 or 5 months. They've had Christmas, he's had a few trips overseas, etc., etc. He's barely had time to get onto the issues. That's a fact of it. That's a fact of it. And I think as at now, we're going to go into the next election. We've got Labor's couple of proposals, going to put up the price of fags, and the coalition at least has one position which I think will go down well with the Australian public, which is they want to see some holding on the, or cutting back on the spending. I think the coalition will do that better than Labor, because basically they say we don't have a problem at all. Hopefully the coalition will have something on workplace relations, and you'll have a usual Australian contest, which is it's a choice between the worst and the least worst, and that'll be your decision.
Okay, look, with that degree of optimism about the political system and where we go.
Yes, so I've got a question for Peter, but well, I'm allowed a question.
Yeah, of course you can. I'll even give you an answer.
So
first.
No, so I was asked the other day. I was doing a speech the other day at Melbourne Uni, and I was asked, blah blah blah, and aren't the Liberals going to win the election easily? And I said, well, these things always tighten up. They're always much closer than they look, and I don't think a runaway victory is a fait accompli at all. But I'm interested in Peter's view about how tight he thinks that will be with the July election.
Well, I've always thought it would be fairly tight, and Gary Gray has persuaded me that his expectation, based on the averages, are that a first-term government gets a second burst. The average Aussies got a pretty open mind about things, and they'd be saying to themselves, oh, well, they haven't been in for long, so we'll give them a bit more time. So I think they'll get in on that basis. I do think that the negative gearing and the capital gains tax on their own, I think will go down like a lead balloon as far as a lot of investors and others in the Australian economy. So I think that's, well, you could say it's a bold move on Labor's part, but as I said before, I think as a tinkering item, it's not all that great, quite frankly, and it's hardly new either. I mean, Keating wanted to do something on negative gearing, so I don't see it's quite as good as the press would have you believe. And I do think something on the spending, and if the coalition can get a few dollars together and offer something on the tax side as well, which is standard Australian practice, that would give them a bit of an edge as well. So, and Malcolm, in fairness to him too, I mean, I think he's put up a sufficient number of shall we say, changes in the operation since the changeover to give him a bit of a, a bit of a head against the rest, and that's obvious if you look at the polling on the, the personality stuff that we see as well. So I think that's where it's going to go, but it is, look, it's a pretty open situation.
Yeah, I'll just give you 2 words to think on, Campbell Newman. But look,
it's not going to be Campbell Newman, mate.
Anastasia Palaszczuk. Questions. We have time for a couple of questions from the audience. There's nothing worse than having 3 recovering politicians sitting in front of you. So we need to get some questions generated here. I have one up in the far corner. Thank you.
Russell Yardley, I'm chairman of Redify and recently listed to Ceren, both technology companies. I was on the board of NICTA and saw the transition from a standalone independent organisation to part of CSIRO, and I've been watching the press around Larry Marshall's great pivot trying to drive real innovation, and the power of the incumbents to fire at any real change is endemic. So when you look at the challenge, Australia wants politicians and Prime Ministers to be authentic and provide great ideas and really deliver real change. But what's the practical way of getting real change when you see those sort of, incumbents really just killing any real change of any chance of innovation?
Well, look, the task of the reformer is unquestionably a difficult one. Look, the Howard government's cabinet, for example, people would say, well, it was a pretty reformist outfit, and I think it was. But it's also true that if you went round the room of what 20, 21 cabinet ministers, there were many occasions where it was hard to get a majority of people who really supported reform. And it's not just a matter of being sort of pessimistic about our future. The fact is that people have different views about issues. They have their own interests. They're entitled to have their own interests, but it can make it difficult to get things through. And many a time, if you read my book, if you don't mind me mentioning my book.
Hey, John, you'll come on in a moment. Yeah.
But it is true. I mean, if I go back over my time, I was often a critic of John Howard, believe it or not, even though I was very close to John and a great supporter of his, I would like to think. But often there were times when decisions were made which I thought weren't nearly as reformist as they ought to be. I'll give you just give you one example. We in the 96, after the 96 election, we basically established we brought to an end the Commonwealth Employment Service, and we set up a private enterprise market, basically. And after a couple of years, we had the remnants of that system, about 10 or 15%, I think, of the market, and it was in government hands. And I was the Minister for Employment, amongst other things, and we put up a proposal to flog it off, which we thought was about time. It was just a leftover anyway. And so we went round the room, got halfway round the room, and they were all in support. And then John Howard says, well, I'm not in favour. And then, of course, it goes around to the other half. Oh, would you believe? All a bit uncertain about the position. And why was that? Because John said, well, look, you might have a very strong argument for flogging off the 15%, but we've made a promise that we won't cut services in the bush. And even though flogging this off would not reduce services to the rural areas, he said, you know what'll be on the front page of the paper tomorrow? Coalition dumps on rural people. And he said, it's just not worth it. And he, naturally enough, I suppose, he was Prime Minister. If he says, no, we're not going to do it, we don't do it, and we didn't, even though basically he was a reformist and was the one who really made it happen in the first place, and we did it sometime later. So, sometimes in politics, the politics overwhelms the reformist, and that's something you just have to put up with.
I've read your book, please, yes.
So I've got a chapter in my book about innovation, no, I have actually. So I'm not across all of the issues in CSIRO, and I've obviously seen the debate for and against the changes that were made. But I think there's a bigger issue, and that is for Australia as a whole, we continue to underinvest in research, in innovation broadly defined, medical research, support for biotechs, and so on. And if you look at what's happening around the world, including with now, on many measures, the world's largest economy, China. China's now the second largest investor in R&D in the world. There are companies in China. I'm on the board of a large Chinese company, Huawei. We spend $12 billion US each year on R&D. And so for Australia, we're just underinvesting in the whole ideas business. And so the statements that Malcolm Turnbull has made as Prime Minister, I endorse and welcome 110%. Ditto the commitments that Bill Shorten made in his budget response last year about supporting STEM and innovation are also very, very positive. So this is a big debate for Australia. Again, some of the things that Amanda talked about before, to make sure that we don't slip behind the rest of the world. If you read my book, I say that for Australia, the economy has changed dramatically from the old days, based around large-scale, mass sort of manufacturing. And for us, we need to be in the new business. New ideas, new ways of doing things, new startups, new businesses, new enterprises. That's really where the jobs are going to come from in the future. And so there's a bigger story here about whether we're investing enough in CSIRO or NHMRC or our universities to get us to the level of cleverness and innovation that we are going to need to compete in the future.
While I haven't specifically written a book on these issues, I can say that CEDA's research reports of the last couple of years have picked up exactly the sorts of things that John Brumby has spoken about. Those of you who have seen that research work will recall that year before last we did something in advanced manufacturing, suggesting that because the car industry might be closing down, it wasn't doom and gloom, that there needed to be, through innovation, product innovation and so on, a completely new industry in Australia. Last year we produced a major piece of work, which of course was on the future of work. And now Prime Minister Turnbull came and spoke at the launch of that in Sydney. We're claiming that therefore is behind the use of the term innovation and where he was taking Australia, so that's fine. But in a very serious way, of course, CEDA has been at the forefront of these debates, and if you haven't seen those reports, they are available online, and I'd very much direct you to our website where you're able to see that. The final thing I will say, because sadly we have run out of time for questions, is that John Brumby alluded a little earlier to the issue that I think has been forgotten in this debate around politics and economics in Australia, and that is the nature of the federal budget deficit. We seem to have dumbed down any discussion about that or put it onto the back pages by simply diverting attention by talking about GST and other issues, as significant as tax reform is going to be. CEDA has looked at this and is tackling this issue, and on the 29th of March our National Chairman will be giving a presentation at the National Press Club in Canberra where we will be putting forward CEDA's views on how this question of the budget deficit can be tackled, and based on two measures. One, of course, on economics, and certainly tackling issues which Peter would be interested in from an expenditure point of view, but importantly as well, putting forward ideas that would be broadly acceptable to both sides of politics without necessarily simply focusing on a narrow debate on whose tax policy is bigger than the others. So I would just keep you informed of that that's happening, and I'm given that we've put a high, powerful, balanced budget commission together to give us advice on this, I think there is something that it will be available for everyone in politics. And perhaps I won't be as negative as Peter and suggest that there might be a sameness that people in Canberra might be able to bring to looking at what an independent third body can suggest to them. I'm not going to hold my breath, but I'm hopeful, nevertheless, Peter, that that's going to be the case. Unfortunately, we have run out of time. Could you please thank our two guests on the political panel?